that are kind of always there in the background, shaping everything around us.
Definitely.
Capitalism and socialism.
Yeah, you can't really escape them, can you?
Not really. I think everyone listening has at least some idea what these are,
Yeah.
but we're going to unpack them properly.
Yeah, get to the core.
Exactly. How do
Yeah.
they work? What are the arguments for and against them? All that, without getting too academic about it.
Yeah.
We've got some really interesting source material to draw on, so
Yeah, some solid stuff.
well, let's jump in.
Well, I think it's fascinating how both of these systems try to tackle the same basic questions about how we organize society, right?
Right.
Like, how do we produce all the stuff we need? Who gets to decide what gets made and how it gets divided up?
Yeah.
And the really big one, who controls the resources that make it all possible. I mean, that's where you see the first big difference between these two.
Yeah, ownership is huge.
Absolutely. Our sources lay out this idea of capitalism as a system where the tools of production land, factories, companies, the whole shebang are largely controlled by private individuals or businesses, and the big motivator, profit.
Okay, so let's break that down a bit. Private ownership.
Yeah.
What does that actually mean in practice?
It means that people like you and me, or a company that we might start, can actually own these resources. They're ours. The profits we make, they belong to us. One of the sources uses the example of starting a business. If it does well, the money it makes is yours. It's your reward for the risk and the effort.
Right, so it incentivizes people to create value. Right.
Exactly. And tied to this whole private ownership thing is the free market.
Ah, supply and demand, all that.
Yeah, exactly. The sources explain that prices in a capitalist system aren't set by the government. They're determined by how much of something is available, the supply, and how badly people want it, the demand.
So if everyone's clamoring for the latest gadget,
Prices go up.
exactly, but if nobody's buying something,
Prices drop.
makes sense. It's like that with everything, you know? Like even something basic like sneakers.
Oh, yeah, totally. Limited edition drops, hype builds up, prices skyrocket.
But then the hype dies down, nobody wants them anymore, prices plummet. Okay, so we've got private ownership, free market, and then there's this big one, the profit motive.
Oh, yeah, that's a driving force.
It seems like everything in capitalism kind of revolves around that. The sources suggest that businesses, because they want to make money, they're constantly pushed to innovate, to get better at what they do, to be more efficient, and ultimately to keep their customers happy.
And the example they give is so clear, the whole phone company thing.
Right. They're always trying to come out with a phone that's better, faster, cheaper.
And if they do it right, they succeed. They make a profit.
Okay, and that leads us to competition, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's the natural outcome.
Because you've got all these businesses, they're all trying to grab the same customers.
Fighting for market share.
And the sources point out that this competition can be a good thing. It drives innovation, leads to better quality, and often lower prices. I mean, just look at Coke versus Pepsi or Apple versus Samsung. It's always a battle.
Right, and we get to reap the benefits.
Now, there's this other concept that comes up a lot with capitalism, limited government involvement.
Laissez-faire, they call it.
Right. The idea is that in a purely capitalist system, the government stays out of the economy as much as possible. But the sources also make a point of saying that in the real world, almost every capitalist country has some level of government intervention.
Yeah, regulations, taxes, things like that.
It's never truly a completely hands-off approach.
No, there's always some degree of control. So looking at the potential upsides of capitalism, one that our sources really emphasize is that it fosters innovation and entrepreneurship.
Yeah, because there's that potential for big rewards.
Right. People are motivated to come up with new ideas, start businesses, invent new products, all because they see a chance to make a profit.
And then there's the freedom aspect, isn't there?
Oh, absolutely. The sources highlight that capitalism generally allows individuals a lot of freedom. You can choose your career path, you decide what you want to buy, you control your own investments. That appeals to a lot of people.
And from a purely economic standpoint, the sources suggest that capitalism can be quite efficient.
Yeah, in terms of how resources are used.
Because businesses, they're driven by profit, and they're responding to what consumers actually want.
Yeah.
So, in theory, resources flow to where they're most needed and valued.
Exactly. But of course, no system is perfect. The sources also point to some potential downsides of capitalism. One of the big ones is economic inequality.
Right, the gap between the rich and the poor.
Yeah, if things aren't managed carefully, that gap can become a real problem.
And then there's the risk of monopolies, right?
Yeah, that's where a single company gets so powerful in a particular market that it can basically squash all the competition.
And they can kind of do what they want, right?
Yeah.
Raise prices, offer limited choices, that kind of thing.
Exactly, consumers lose out. And then there's this idea that a system that's mainly focused on profit might not be so great at providing things like universal health care or education for everyone.
Because those things might not be profitable for private companies.
Right. So the sources argued that these essential public goods might get neglected in a purely profit-driven system.
Okay, so those are some of the potential downsides. The sources then give us some real-world examples of capitalism in action. The U.S. is often held up as kind of a classic example.
Yeah, but it's not the only flavor of capitalism out there.
Right. The sources point to countries like Canada, Germany, and Japan. They're also considered capitalist economies, but they tend to have more robust social programs and more government regulation.
Yeah, they're often called mixed economies. It shows that capitalism can exist in different forms with different balances.
Okay, so now let's turn our attention to socialism.
All right, shifting gears.
The sources define socialism as a system where, again, it comes down to ownership, but this time, the means of production are owned collectively.
Usually by the government, acting on behalf of the people.
Right, so instead of private individuals or companies owning things like factories and land, it's the public that owns them.
Yeah, and the goal is often to create a more equal society where everyone's basic needs are met.
One of the sources gives the example of publicly owned hospitals and schools, which are common in many countries that lean towards socialist principles.
Yeah, it changes the whole dynamic of how those essential services are run and paid for.
Okay, so ownership is different. But what about decision-making? In capitalism, it's all about the free market, supply and demand.
Right, but in a socialist system, things work a bit differently. The sources talk about central planning or democratic planning, where decisions about what gets produced and how resources are used are made collectively, often by the government.
So instead of letting the market forces dictate everything, there's more deliberate planning involved.
Exactly. Like, imagine the government deciding to build a bunch of affordable housing or to massively expand public transportation.
Right, that's a conscious decision to allocate resources in a specific way to meet a societal need.
Yeah. And another key mechanism that comes up a lot with socialism is wealth redistribution.
So that's where the government taxes wealthier individuals and corporations at a higher rate.
Exactly. And then they use that money to fund social programs and support those who are less well off.
Like free college tuition, universal health care, things like that.
Yeah, those are good examples of how wealth redistribution can play out in practice. And underlying all of this is a real focus on equality.
Trying to level the playing field, essentially.
Right. The aim is to reduce the gap between the rich and the poor and ensure a decent standard of living for everyone in society.
Okay, so what do the sources say about the potential advantages of socialism?
Well, one of the big ones is that it has the potential to significantly reduce poverty and inequality.
Which could lead to a more just and harmonious society.
Where, yeah, that's the idea. And it could also lead to a stronger guarantee of basic human needs. Everyone would have access to things like healthcare, education, and housing, regardless of their income level.
Right, because those things would be seen as rights, not privileges.
Exactly. And the sources also point out that socialist ideologies often place a strong emphasis on community and social welfare.
So it's less about individual gain and more about collective well-being.
Right. It's a different way of thinking about societal values. But as with any system, there are potential downsides to socialism too. One concern that the sources bring up is that it could reduce incentives for individual innovation and hard work.
Because if everyone's taken care of, regardless of how much they contribute.
Yeah, some argue that it could lead to less motivation to strive for excellence or to come up with new ideas.
Right, because the rewards might not be as directly tied to individual effort.
Another potential problem the sources mention is the risk of inefficiency and bureaucracy. Central planning can be really complex.
It's a lot for the government to handle.
Yeah, and there's a chance that resources might not be allocated as efficiently as they would be in a more market-driven system. And then there's the concern about government overreach.
Right, too much control.
Yeah, particularly in more authoritarian forms of socialism. The sources caution that individual freedoms could be curtailed.
So to get a better sense of how socialism plays out in the real world, the sources offer some examples.
Yeah, and it's important to note that there are different flavors of socialism out there.
Right, it's not just one monolithic thing.
The sources distinguish between modern socialist-leaning countries, often called social democracies, and more state-controlled socialist systems.
So social democracies like in Scandinavia, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, those are countries with capitalist economies,
Yeah.
but they have really strong social safety nets and a lot of government involvement in things like healthcare and education.
Yeah, it's kind of a hybrid model.
Yeah.
And then you have countries like Cuba, Venezuela, and historically the Soviet Union, where the state has much more control over the economy and there's less reliance on free markets.
And the sources make a really important distinction here. They emphasize the difference between democratic socialism, which is what you see in a lot of European countries,
Sure.
and more authoritarian forms of socialism.
Yeah, it's crucial to understand that socialism isn't just one thing. It can manifest in very different ways.
Okay, so we've explored both capitalism and socialism, looking at their core principles, how they work, the potential pros and cons. And it seems like in the real world, things are rarely black and white.
Yeah, pure capitalism and pure socialism are more like theoretical ideals.
As we touched on earlier, a lot of countries have mixed economies.
Yeah, they blend elements of both systems.
You might have a thriving private sector, but also significant government investment in social programs and regulations to protect consumers and the environment.
It highlights the complexity of these systems, and the debate about how best to balance capitalist and socialist ideas is ongoing. There's no easy answer.
Right, so after this deep dive, I hope everyone listening has a better understanding of these two really foundational economic systems.
Yeah, I think we've covered a lot of ground.
And it leaves us with a final thought to chew on.
A question to ponder.
Thinking about all the advantages and disadvantages we've discussed, what kind of balance between capitalist and socialist principles do you think works best?
Yeah, what balance do you think serves the needs of society while also protecting individual freedom? And why? There's no right or wrong answer, but it's a question worth thinking about as we all try to make sense of the world around us.
It's something we all need to grapple with as we move forward.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. We'll catch you next time.